Rates, I looked it up. The absolute low for mortgage rates was in 2021. It got down to 2.65%. There are people out there that got a mortgage that low. But now we're at 7.4. People cannot afford to pay these prices at a 7.4% rate. Now, remember, I looked this up too. The peak of mortgage rates was 1981. So it took 40 years for mortgage rates to go from a record high to a record low. The record high in 1981, believe it or not, was 18.45%. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine buying a house with an 18.45% mortgage? Because somebody did that, right? Because somebody must have borrowed it to set the record. But that was a huge decline over a 40-year time period. And that big decline in mortgage rates is really what enabled families to buy homes, because otherwise they couldn't have afforded it, especially given how much the prices went up. And that was how they could do it. Now, there was another way. I mentioned this on Twitter. Some people took it the wrong way. But the other reason that families were able to buy homes, it wasn't just that the mortgage rates went down. It was that married women, got jobs and helped their husbands pay the mortgage. Because prior to 1981, not as nearly as many women were working. They started entering the workforce in the 1970s. And again, that was the result of inflation. The dollar collapsed during the 1970s. And that was basically a huge tax increase on every guy who had a job, because the inflation tax reduced the value of his paycheck, his income, and prices went way up, and his salary didn't keep pace. How did he pay the bills? How did he put food on the table, right? Well, his wife got a job, because prior to that, in the 1960s, married women weren't working. It kind of didn't even matter what job you had. It wasn't like you had to be rich to have a stay-at-home wife. You were a policeman, you were a truck driver, fireman, janitor, whatever. You could still afford to support your wife. Not in the same style that a doctor or a lawyer could support their wife, but you could still support her and you could support your kids. But after the huge inflation tax of the 1970s, people couldn't do that anymore. If you were rich, the doctor could still support his wife, but not the teacher, right? Not the truck driver. Their wives had to go get jobs. And so all these married women contributing and the big decline in mortgage rates, that kept everybody going. That's how people were able to buy homes. Well, how are they going to buy them now? Because now mortgage rates are not super low anymore. They're 7.4 and rising. They're going to keep rising. The big bond bull market is over, and yields are going to keep on rising because of inflation and supply. That's what's driving it. Not growth, not jobs, but inflation and this enormous supply of bonds that is hitting the market without any buyers. So real estate prices have to go down. What are we going to do? Are we going to pull our kids out of school and get them to have jobs so we can pay for a house? No, all the women are already working, right? So, we've played that card. It's gone. We don't have a spare, worker to come off the sidelines and get in the game, right? Everybody's been playing. And so, prices have got to go. It's just a question of time, but also that big increase in home equity that was made possible by artificially low mortgages, but also, of course, the government guaranteed mortgages. So lending money to somebody to buy a house was also risk-free because you had full faith and credit of the U.S. government. But those super low mortgage rates pushed up home prices. And then what did that do? That enabled home equity loans. That gave a lot of Americans a lifeline. As inflation was reducing the real value of their incomes, even with two people working, they were able to cover the bills by borrowing against their homes. That was a big part of the consumer-based economy, was that low interest rates enabled serial refinancing. And every time a homeowner was kind of running out of money, he just got to tap into that well, and voila, more cash to spend. Well, that game is over. Nobody's refinancing anymore. It's not even possible, right? And there's no more big increase in home prices. That's not possible either, because nobody could afford to buy a home because they can't get a cheap mortgage. So that was another thing driving the consumer-based bubble economy. Well, again, that's gone. And so nobody really appreciates how much downward pressure this is problems for everybody. We've been riding a wave of cheap money. And now that wave is coming crashing down on our heads, and nobody has figured this out. You know, the investors out there are just looking at these bond yields and just assuming that inflation is going to come back down and it's going to be the status quo all over again. That's never going to happen. That was the aberration. We're never going back to that fantasy land again. We have to live in reality. We are a massive debtor nation. We have an unprecedented amount of debt, and that either means interest rates skyrocket or inflation skyrockets, one or the other. And it's much more likely from a politically expedient perspective that what's going to give is inflation. We couldn't cut spending when the Republicans had the White House, when Trump was president, when in his first 2 years he had a Republican House and a Republican Senate. No cutting of any spending when the Republicans were in charge. There's no cutting of spending when the Democrats are in charge. And even when we have mixed government, spending doesn't get cut. There's no political scenario where spending gets cut.